Lecture 11, Justinian and the Byzantine Empire.
Welcome back. In the last lecture, we examined the transition from Roman Britain to Anglo-Saxon England, and we saw how Britain experienced the collapse of Rome as a relatively swift and severe shock, certainly when compared to what had happened on the European continent. Today we're going to leap from one end of the Roman Empire to the other, moving from Anglo-Saxon England to the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which historians call the Byzantine Empire. We're going to focus especially on one very active and influential emperor by the name of Justinian. And the Byzantine Empire and Justinian command our attention for a number of reasons. Justinian is every bit as remarkable as the much more famous Charlemagne. And the mere existence of the Byzantine Empire, which does not collapse in 476, which does not finally fall until the Turks captured Constantinople in 1453, is going to force us later in this course to rethink the question of why did the Roman Empire fall? Because in 476, only half of the Roman Empire fell. The eastern half was going to outlast the West by almost 1,000 years. If you look up the word Byzantine in an English language dictionary, you will find the following definition, or one very like it. Byzantine, an adjective, of, relating to, or marked by intrigue, devious. It would indeed have been strange for a group of people to adopt for themselves a name meaning devious, because announcing one's duplicity to all the world rather defeats the purpose of being duplicitous. It tends to put people on their guard when you tell them that you are about to lie to them. In fact, the inhabitants of the Byzantine Empire never called their empire the Byzantine Empire, nor did they call themselves the Byzantines. The term Byzantine Empire is coined in the 16th and 17th centuries by scholars. The name comes from the fact that Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was founded on the site of an old fishing village known as Byzantium. And the inhabitants of the Byzantine Empire, if you had asked them who they were and what their empire was called, would have responded, "We're the Romans, and we live in the Roman Empire." And they would have said this in the 5th century, and they would have said this in the 15th century. They were convinced that they were still the Roman Empire going strong. Was this delusion? No, not entirely, because there is a great deal of continuity between the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire. There is continuity at the level of imperial office. You do not have the office of emperor dying out for more than 3 centuries, as was going to happen in the West. Byzantine education, Byzantine culture always stays closer to its classical roots than medieval culture was going to. Yet Byzantine Empire was different in some respects from the Roman Empire, and therefore there is some justification in using the term Byzantine Empire and differentiating between the Byzantines on the one hand and the Romans on the other. And perhaps the most important difference concerns language. During the heyday of the Roman Empire, Latin is the official language of the empire. Laws are issued in Latin, for example. And well-educated Romans were expected to be bilingual, perfectly at home with both Greek and Latin, in terms of speaking, in terms of reading, and in terms of writing. When Diocletian severed the western half of the empire from the eastern half of the empire, when the western half of the empire disappeared entirely, West and East began to follow different trajectories and go their own ways. And this was going to be the case linguistically. Knowledge of Greek was going to die out in the West during the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries. St. Augustine himself was very shaky in terms of his Greek. Some have suggested that he didn't know Greek at all to speak of. And by about 600, knowledge of Greek in the West is going to be very rare indeed. As for the inhabitants of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, they stopped using Latin and reverted back to Greek almost entirely. Byzantine emperors, for example, stopped issuing their laws in Latin, since there are not that many Latin-speaking subjects in our empire anymore. And by about 600, they are issuing all of their laws in Greek. They abandoned their old Latin titles, such as imperator, and instead adopt Greek titles for themselves, basileus, for example. And the fact that the Byzantine Empire is predominantly a Greek-speaking empire does differentiate it from the Roman Empire. When Odoacer had deposed the last Western emperor in 476, he had tried not to offend the Byzantine emperor by sending imperial regalia back to him. But we've already seen how this did not exactly placate Byzantine emperors. They had employed the Ostrogoths and Theodoric in an unsuccessful attempt to reimpose Byzantine control over Italy, although all it resulted in was the establishment of the Ostrogothic kingdom. I guess the Byzantines will have to try and do their dirty work themselves. One Byzantine emperor, Justinian, was going to attempt to reconquer Italy on behalf of the Byzantines, and indeed it's possible that Justinian, who ruled from 527 to 565, entertained the possibility of reconquering the whole of the western half of the empire and trying to recreate the Roman Empire as it had once existed. Were it not for a major political disaster early in his relatively long reign, Justinian might never have attempted the reconquest of Italy or the West at all. Early in his reign, Justinian was nearly overthrown by chariot hooligans, who were every bit as nasty as modern soccer hooligans. The Byzantines, being the Roman Empire, maintained the sport of chariot racing. And the two most important teams in the Byzantine Empire were identified by the colors they wore. They were the blues and the greens. And the fans of the blues and greens usually did not get along very well. When they encountered each other in the streets, they would begin to brawl. And these brawls could have a direct impact on the imperial government because the main sports stadium in Constantinople, the Hippodrome, was located very near the imperial palace as well. And so brawls might spill over into the imperial palace. The brawling of the blues and the greens was bad enough, but even worse was when the blues and the greens decided, for once, to unite forces against the common enemy. And the person whom they disliked was the Emperor Justinian. In 532, rioting broke out in Constantinople as the blues and the greens decided to try and overthrow Justinian in a revolt known as the Nika revolt, which comes from the Greek word for victory. And Justinian contemplated abdicating in the face of this revolt and fleeing Constantinople. He was persuaded to remain by his wife Theodora, who told him to be a man and to massacre the rioters, which is what a real emperor would do. And Justinian saw the wisdom of this and indeed put down the revolt rather harshly. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that Justinian's attempts to reconquer parts of the western half of the empire were launched in an attempt to gain some popularity with the inhabitants of the Byzantine Empire to prop up his rule after the near debacle of the Nika revolt. Justinian prepared for his attempt to reconquer parts of the West, perhaps the whole of the West, carefully. And he was indeed a very methodical individual. He decided to secure the eastern flank of the Byzantine Empire, where the Persian Empire is still in existence. He signs a peace treaty with the Persians in 532, a treaty of eternal peace, pledging that eternal peace will exist between the Byzantines and their longtime rivals. He sets his sights initially not on Italy, but on Vandal North Africa, which he wants to recapture. And the individual to whom he entrusts this important task was a general by the name of Belisarius. Before invading Vandal North Africa in 533, Justinian decided to improve the odds on his behalf, and he secretly bribed the Vandal governor of the island of Sicily to rebel against the Vandal kings, in the hope that was eventually realized that the Vandal army would travel to Sicily and create an opportunity for Belisarius to attack Vandal North Africa. Bribing the Vandal governor of Sicily and tricking the Vandals essentially to leaving North Africa undefended was, well, rather Byzantine of this emperor, and it's not an accident that the term Byzantine means crafty or devious, because Byzantine rulers tended to excel at this sort of trickery. The plan went almost exactly as Justinian intended it to. The Vandals collapsed quite rapidly, and by 534, Vandal North Africa had been reabsorbed into the old Roman Empire, or at least into its eastern half. And at the rate of one barbarian kingdom a year, well, the reconquest of the West could be accomplished in just 4 or 5 more years. Subsequent attacks were not going to go quite as well, however. Justinian was going to follow up his attack against Vandal North Africa with an attack on Ostrogothic Italy itself. And here, too, it's somewhat unclear whether Justinian had a master plan whereby he intended to recapture the whole of the West, or whether he was really an opportunist who responded to developments as they arose. For example, in Italy, the Ostrogoths were ruled over by a queen in the early 530s by the name of Amalasuntha. And Amalasuntha was notably pro-Byzantine. She had very good relations with Justinian, and there was some consideration of a peaceful reunification of Ostrogothic Italy and the Byzantine Empire. Perhaps through an arranged marriage of some sort, the Ostrogoths and the Byzantines would merge. However, due to internal political problems, Amalasuntha was forced to accept a co-ruler, a relative of hers, a cousin by the name of Theodahad. And with a rotten name like Theodahad, she should have seen what was to come. Theodahad murdered Amalasuntha and made himself sole ruler of Ostrogothic Italy. And Justinian claimed that, well, since he had such a wonderful relationship with Amalasuntha, he was bound to avenge this murder. And indeed, he invades Ostrogothic Italy in 535. Whether he ever would have invaded Italy if Amalasuntha had lived, whether there would indeed have been a peaceful reunification of Italy and Rome with the Byzantine Empire, is a moot question. The invasion of Ostrogothic Italy, launched by the Byzantines in 535, at first went very well for the Byzantines and looked as though the Ostrogoths were going to collapse almost as quickly as the Vandals had done. In the space of just 5 years, Belisarius and the Byzantines succeeded in pushing the Ostrogoths northward until they were confined to an area north of the Po River Valley, which is in the far north of Italy, and nearly the whole of the Italian peninsula was under Byzantine control. And it looked as though Justinian could do no wrong in his attempt to reconquer western territories. However, Justinian caught some bad breaks in the 540s. Some of them he should have anticipated, and some of them no human being could possibly have foreseen. The one that he should have anticipated involved his relations with the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was alarmed at the speed with which Justinian was conquering parts of the West and feared that once he gained access to the resources of the West, he'd be that much more formidable a foe to them. Therefore, they had better put a stop to this by breaking the Treaty of Eternal Peace 8 years after it had been signed. And in 540, the Persian Empire launches an attack against the Byzantines and captures Byzantine territory in Syria and Palestine. They even succeed in sacking what was the third largest city in the Byzantine Empire, Antioch. Justinian realizes that the situation in the east is desperate, and so he withdraws Belisarius from Italy, where he was poised to finally wipe out the Ostrogoths, and rushes him to the east to fight against the Persians. The Ostrogoths are heartened at the departure of Belisarius and the fact that the Byzantines are now fighting a two-front war, and this allows them to rally their forces and take a stand north of the Po River. What Justinian could not have foreseen was a far worse piece of luck. In 542, there was a massive outbreak of disease in the Byzantine Empire all around the Mediterranean. And this outbreak of disease is known as the Justinianic Plague. Most likely, this represents the first introduction of bubonic plague into the Byzantine Empire and spreading from there into Europe. And the bubonic plague, after striking in 542, 543, continued to come back on a regular basis every decade under normal circumstances. And although it is impossible to be precise about the mortality rates that people had to endure during the bubonic plague of the 6th century, a reasonable estimate is that the Byzantine Empire lost a third of its population within a decade or two of the appearance of bubonic plague. In other words, 1 out of every 3 people died in the space of 10 to 20 years. Now the Byzantine Empire is faced not just with the prospect of war in the East and the West against the Persians and Ostrogoths respectively. They have experienced a tremendous drop in manpower, a tremendous drop in tax revenue, and more general disruption caused by such a huge loss of human beings in a short period of time. Despite these 2 major setbacks, Justinian did not abandon the attack on Italy, and in a sense, he was right not to do so. The war against the Ostrogoths dragged on much longer than anyone would have guessed in 540. It does end in 554 with Byzantine victory over the Ostrogoths, who disappear from history at that point. But those 14 additional years of war put an enormous strain on the Byzantine Empire because the Ostrogoths had fought well during that period and inflicted severe casualties on a Byzantine Empire that was not in a position demographically to absorb casualties. It had also resulted in a tremendous amount of destruction in Italy itself. Many of the cities and towns are burned down during the fighting between the Byzantines and the Ostrogoths, and as a sign of the disruption that these wars caused, the Roman Senate, for example, ceased to function as a body once and for all during these wars. Despite the fact that the war in Italy had not gone as well as he had hoped, Justinian launched still further attempts to conquer parts of the western half of the empire. He even has the Byzantines invade Visigothic Spain in 552. They succeed in capturing just a small sliver of the southern tip of Visigothic Spain, but nonetheless part of Spain comes back under Roman control. One would think that with all of these wars taking place and with bubonic plague erupting, Justinian had his hands full and would not undertake anything else. But that's not the case with Justinian, who was involved in a remarkable number of different activities, some of which went well for him and some of which did not. Justinian was tough on heretics and on pagans and devoted some of his energy toward eliminating paganism from the Byzantine Empire. You could still find in Justinian's lifetime people in the Byzantine Empire, usually philosophers or very wealthy senators, who openly admitted to their paganism, even if they would not dare to worship publicly as pagans. And Justinian wanted to stamp out these last few pockets of pagan belief. One of the main centers of pagan teaching in the Byzantine Empire was Athens. And in 529, Justinian forbade the teaching of philosophy at Athens, essentially depriving of pagan philosophers, depriving them of their livelihood. And this law had the effect of shutting down one of the oldest educational institutions in the world, the Platonic Academy at Athens, founded by Plato and in existence for nearly 1,000 years. It has finally comes to an end as a result of the actions of Justinian. Justinian was a very controversial figure in his day, and he was intensely disliked by many, and not just by pagans and heretics. Indeed, he was capable of inspiring an almost insane hatred on the part of some of his subjects, and we can get a sense of the depth of this hatred by reading one of the most important, albeit difficult sources of information about Justinian written during this period. It's a slim book called by modern editors The Secret History, and it's composed by an important Byzantine official by the name of Procopius. Procopius was secretary to Belisarius. He's his personal assistant, and so he's in a position to know a good deal about Justinian and the workings of the highest levels of the Byzantine government. A number of Procopius's writings circulated during his lifetime. He publishes them while he's still alive. And in these writings, Procopius speaks quite respectfully about Justinian, about the Empress Theodora. At times he's almost admiring of them. The secret history, on the other hand, did not circulate during his lifetime, and he indicates that he did not want it to circulate during his lifetime. Its existence does not become widely known until centuries afterward. And in the secret history, Procopius put down what he claimed was what he really thought about Justinian and Theodora. Ideas that would have gotten him killed, according to Procopius, if anyone realized that these were his views. Procopius, in the secret history, performs one of the most gruesome hatchet jobs ever performed on any political leader, ripping Justinian and Theodora into pieces for a number of different reasons. And some of the accusations that Procopius levels against Justinian are certainly true. Some of them, however, boggle the mind. Procopius accused Justinian of extorting taxes to an unprecedented degree from his subjects and employing all sorts of legal tricks and maneuvers to get more money out of his subjects, which is almost certainly true, even as he cut back on governmental services such as the postal service, which is still functioning in the Byzantine Empire in Justinian's day, or the intelligence service, which was tasked with spying on the Persians. And this accusation is also probably true. Procopius accused Justinian of being a demon in human form, and that is less certain. He rarely slept, that we know. He would wander around the imperial palace all hours of the day and night, and he rarely ate, and that also seems quite true. He had almost superhuman energy and endurance. However, Procopius's accusations or claims that Justinian's head would disappear routinely as he strolled around the imperial palace, or that his face would occasionally be transformed into a lump of shapeless flesh until it flashed back again to human form, seems somewhat dubious, as does his claim that Theodora, prior to her marriage to Justinian, had an illicit and intimate relationship with a goose. Justinian, despite the frequent disappearance of his head, accomplished much. Between 532 and 537, Justinian sponsored the reconstruction of the Church of the Hagia Sophia, or the Holy Wisdom, in Constantinople, creating one of the world's greatest architectural marvels. And contemporaries claimed that Justinian intended the Church of the Hagia Sophia to be the biggest Christian church in the world at that time, which it most likely was, and to excel in its grandeur, even the temple built by Solomon in Jerusalem. Historians give some credence to the claim that Justinian exulted upon the completion of the Hagia Sophia, that Solomon, I have outdone you. The Church of the Hagia Sophia, which is still there today, although the minarets are a later addition following the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, is enormous in size. The central dome is 165 feet high, and it is still not entirely certain why it hasn't fallen down and what is holding it up. Some of the architectural principles at work are still being studied by scholars. As if building the biggest church in the world was not enough to keep him busy, Justinian also decided to sponsor a major recodification of Roman law. Roman law was a mess in Justinian's lifetime. It was filled with rulings that contradicted one another. Different law books referred to different precedents. Justinian wanted to bring order to this mess. And so he ordered scholars to go through the old Roman law books and imperial letters and to get rid of the contradictions and to put all of these materials into a relatively accessible form so that judges would know where to look when they had to make rulings. And as a result of his efforts, scholars produced a series of books. The Justinianic Code, for example, the Digest, the Institutes, which were going to become the basis for all subsequent Roman law, not just in the Byzantine Empire, but also in the medieval West, which would take over the Justinianic Code and the Digest and study these texts. He was also involved in smuggling. Justinian encouraged the smuggling of silkworms out of China so that the Byzantines could make silk as well, and in this endeavor he was successful. But for all of his successes, and the construction of Hagia Sophia, the recodification of Roman law, should be counted as successes, Justinian probably did more harm to the Byzantine Empire than good in the long run, because the Byzantines were unable to hold on to their conquests, and following the death of Justinian came very close to being overrun themselves by their enemies. The first area to be lost, ironically, was northern Italy itself, which had cost the Byzantines so much to acquire. Justinian, before his death, had permitted yet another barbarian tribe known as the Lombards to cross the Danube River into Byzantine territory, in part because he had his hands full and couldn't be bothered trying to defend that part of the empire. The Lombards sensed the precariousness of the Byzantine situation in Italy, however, and they swept into northern Italy in 568, retaking much of the territory that the Byzantines had conquered there. They do not get rid of the Byzantines entirely. The city of Rome remains a Byzantine possession for some time to come. Southern Italy is still a Byzantine possession, but the loss in the space of a single year of northern Italy was a severe blow to the Byzantines. Indeed, after Justinian had died, the Byzantine Empire had to go over onto the defensive as new groups moved into Byzantine territory. One such group was the Slavs, who make their appearance in Eastern Europe during the 6th century and begin to raid across the Danube River into Byzantine territory. The Slavs deserve some attention because they succeeded in doing what no other barbarian group had succeeded in doing, establishing themselves permanently within Byzantine territory. Every other barbarian group had bounced over into the western half of the empire, but the Slavs were going to move into eastern territory and they were going to stay there. They migrate down into the Balkans and spread all the way through mainland Greece for a time during the 580s. They even seize Athens for a short period. While the Byzantines succeed in pushing the Slavs out of Greece, they lose the Balkans to the Slavs and lose a source of manpower for the Byzantine army thereby. The Persians, seeing the Byzantines suffering with the Slavic invasions, decided that this would be a good time to attack the Byzantine Empire again. And in the 610s, the Persians seized Damascus, they seized Jerusalem from the Byzantines, and they seized Egypt as well. In fact, they overrun most of Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, and by the early 7th century, the Byzantine Empire is largely confined to the city of Constantinople and some territory in Greece as well. It has shrunk in size considerably and looks as though it might be overrun entirely. The Persians also administered a severe psychological blow to the Byzantines because during their conquests of Jerusalem and Egypt in the 610s, they seized from the Byzantines one of the most sacred relics in all of Christendom. There was a relic known as the True Cross. It was a piece of wood that was believed to have come from the cross on which Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. The Byzantines lost this to the Persians, and some saw this as a sign of imminent Byzantine collapse and divine disfavor. The low point comes in the 620s, when the Slavs from one side and the Persians from another side and another group known as the Avars all converge on Constantinople itself and besiege the capital. It looked like it was all over. However, Constantinople was one of the most defensible cities in the world, and Constantine had chosen his site for the capital of the eastern half of the empire very well. It's located at the far southeastern tip of the European continent on a spit of land, so you can only approach it by land from one direction, which makes it easy to kill attackers. And Constantinople was able to hold out against the siege. Still, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius was very alarmed by the situation and decided to risk everything on a last gamble. He was going to leave Constantinople in 622 with a large part of the Byzantine army and attack the Persian Empire, just march straight into it and attempt to force the Persians to abandon their attempts to capture Constantinople, figuring the best defense is a good offense. The gamble worked. in this instance. The Persian army had to withdraw from Asia Minor, and indeed the ruler of the Persian Empire is overthrown in a coup in 628 because of the damage being done by the Byzantines. And as a result, Heraclius is able to defeat the Persians and gain back the territories that had been lost in the 610s. He even gains back the relic of the true cross that had been lost. Now, to conclude, the eastern half of the Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, survives the barbarian migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries by roughly a millennium. Although it became an officially Greek-speaking rather than Latin-speaking empire, Byzantine Empire was going to experience more continuity with the classical past than you could find even in the Gothic kingdoms of the West. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian had a number of notable accomplishments, such as the construction of the Church of the Hagia Sophia, but his attempts to reconquer territories in the West overtaxed the Byzantine Empire, which came perilously close to suffering the same fate as the western half of the empire during the early 7th century, collapsing before its enemies. In the next lecture, we're going to see how both the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire faced a common foe suddenly in the early 7th century as the Arabs started to construct the House of Islam.